In a world where many people see reality as a circle or a rectangle, the truth is that issues are cylinders. Rather than a two-dimensional understanding, we will flush out the three-dimension complexities through nuanced conversation and civil, respectable discourse to highlight all perspectives on controversial issues. I'm your host, William Roosh, a high school teacher who's trying to transform education as we know it. Welcome to the Anti-Echo Chamber. This is Cylinder Radio. Hello and welcome to the next lesson of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher and high school history teacher. And I'm doing another episode on history, this one more specifically entitling Blind Spots in History. And my guest today is an expert on one of those blind spots, and I want to see even if it is a blind spot. And that is Catherine Wanner, and she is a professor of history and anthropology at my alma mater, Penn State. And she has an expertise in Ukraine and Russia. And that is what we're going to be talking about today, specifically about the education surrounding the Soviet experiment, Stalinism, and the USSR, and the horrors that came out of that time period, and what I feel is a blind spot in the educational system in America, that we do not focus on that very much, and it's having effects on our society, and I think we should. So one of the cool things about having a podcast is I can reach out to experts and bring them on here and pick their brain and then share these ideas with all of you. So Professor, thank you so much for coming on here. Can you just introduce yourself to us a bit and tell us why you would be a good person to talk to when we talk about socialism and the history of the Soviet Union and things like that?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, Will. It's a pleasure to be here. I should perhaps start by saying that when I was a student myself, I traveled to the USSR. That was in 1981, and I studied there. It was a tremendously interesting experience. I had studied Russian language in middle school and in high school, and so by the time then I got to college, I was still studying Russian, but at this point I was more focused on literature and history, and I had the opportunity to travel there. It was right after the USSR invaded Afghanistan, and the U.S. declared a boycott of the Olympics, which were scheduled to be in Moscow at that time. So it was a tremendously interesting time to be there. And so I got some exposure to life in the Soviet Union. And with that, I was kind of hooked. And by the time I went to graduate school in 1989, it was when things were completely changing in Eastern Europe and in what is now the former Soviet Union. And I realized that having spent many years studying Russian and being familiar with the history and the culture of that part of the world, that on one level I was kind of uniquely situated to begin to do research in that part of the world. And so I did. And it continues to be a place that fascinates me. And so I have yet to turn my gaze away from that part of the world. And I'd say for the past 25 or so years, my research has focused almost exclusively on Ukraine, and in particular on the politics of religion in the former Soviet Union.
Interesting. So when you say you were hooked, is this because it was just a fascinating, different kind of way of living, or was it like, what was it like? Can you pinpoint like what was it that just was such a calling for you that you kind of dedicated your life to this specific area? And what from that trip? Yeah.
Among other things, I realized almost immediately that nothing was as I expected it to be. In sort of in a softer side of things, I kind of expected it to be the Soviet Union to be Russian, because Russian was the primary language, and all of our news coverage and once again high school textbooks, they focused very much on Russia and on the Kremlin and what was going on in Moscow. But even riding around on the metro in Moscow, you could just see right away that the peoples of the former Soviet Union were a highly diverse group. Of course, Russian was the primary language in this enormous 11 time zone country, but it was a hugely multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multilingual country, which all you had to do was walk down the streets in Moscow and you would see this. And so that was something which I didn't expect. I didn't realize when I signed up for this study abroad program, it was an English professor who was leading it, but it also turned out that he was a priest in or a deacon, I should say, in the Orthodox Church. And so on one level, being with a lot of teenagers who were not really interested in religion, I nonetheless was kind of interested in the fact that there were all these people that were interested in him. Because knowing something about history and about the Soviet Union, you knew that open religious practice was supposedly not possible. And yet with him, I was able to go to these different churches that were open and meet with people who were believers and who actively sought out this man who was himself an Orthodox believer coming from the West. There were other moments, for example, I grew up in high school, for example, and even all throughout my school years, having civil defense drills where we were preparing for the Soviet Union to attack the US. Yeah. And as kids, we sat under our desks in these drills to prepare for the imminent attack. And yet when I got to the Soviet Union, you realize most people didn't even have a working telephone in their home, that there was such a tremendous waiting list to get a telephone that the overwhelming majority of people didn't even have a telephone in their apartment. And things like cars, they were in tremendous deficit, along with a whole host of other consumer goods. So, here was this country that we were supposedly so fearful of.
Yeah.
And yet, on a material level, and particularly in a consumer realm, it was a tremendously impoverished place. And that was even before all the real shortages started. Right. So in short, I guess I realized very quickly that although we criticized the USSR for its propaganda, it became clear to me that we also had a fair amount of propaganda going on in the US. And that's one of the reasons why things like this multi-ethnic population, a religiously active population, and the dearth of consumer goods was really a surprise to me.
Yeah, that resonates with me so much, because the whole reason why I started this podcast was because I had these events in my life where it was like the end of like an M. Night Shyamalan movie where it's like, oh my gosh, everything I thought was true about this thing is actually maybe the opposite. And it's like, oh man, what is real? What is up? What is down? All that kind of stuff. And I am so turned on by that too. So that resonates with me. So where, I guess at the foundation of what I want to talk about regarding this is there's of the political spectrum, there's like the extreme right and the extreme left, and there's the center, let's say. Okay, and so extreme right is always known as Nazism, and that's of the authoritarian. If it's order and chaos, okay, so it's like it's an extreme order. So then the other side would be like extreme chaos, maybe. Maybe that's overly simplistic, but it's kind of the way that I tend to think about it. And Nazism is very well covered as far as the evils of what happened in the camps and everything like that. Last spring, about a year ago, I spent 10 days going throughout Poland, and we went to Treblinka, and Auschwitz, and Majdanek, and all these different camps, one after another. I went with a bunch of people I'm very close to who are Orthodox Jewish and had lost family members there, and it was shocking. And I had known the stories, but to be there was shocking. And I asked one of the tour guides, I said, is there something like this for like the gulags, for like the Soviet Union, for the tens of millions of people killed in the Soviet Union? And he said, well, not really, because it's still, it's like different on a whole bunch of different things, and it's still Russia in power and all that kind of stuff. And that opened my eyes up to the fact that I want to know what is the gross details. I think that's an important thing in history. So I guess my question for you is would that be accurate to say that this side is not the horrors of what was happening, not the positives, but the horrors of what happened during in Stalinism, are not spoken about or taught about? And would you say that's accurate? And also, if that is, why do you think that is? And I know it's a big question, but yeah, that's where I'm
I think probably the horrors of Stalinism are less well known than the horrors of Nazism, and there's lots of reasons for that. The first thing I would say is, I don't think one should think about those two regimes like on a linear level, like with Nazism being the very far right and order, and Stalinism being on the far left, chaos. I think when regimes become so extreme, it's actually quite a circle, and in one sense, they actually meet. They're highly authoritarian and highly ordered, highly disciplined regimes, but just with different objects of
right,
their control. Right. They're seeking to eliminate different groups. But you're right, in some instances, when it comes to camps and prisons, they're using very similar means. But because they're both so highly authoritarian, on one sense, they meet. Mm-hmm. So I don't see them as being very far apart. And in order to be so, on one level, it was not, economic production was not efficient in the USSR always. But political control also sometimes was not efficient, but sometimes it was highly efficient. So I'm not certain I associate it with chaos. There was a certain amount of order and discipline that made those kinds of horrors possible, so that when a command or an order or some kind of program was instituted, it was implemented, whether or not people thought it was a good idea or whether they agreed with it. And I think that's precisely what makes it an authoritarian regime.
Would that be like maybe, yeah, because I agree with you, and that they end up at the same thing, but maybe it's like two pathways to get there. One is like starting from, extreme hierarchy on like the right, and then the other one is like the elimination of hierarchy. But in order to eliminate that hierarchy, we need to use authoritarian tactics. Something
right,
like
except for, of course, the Communist Party itself was very hierarchical, and that was the means by which a lot of these policies were implemented. So, one of the goals of the Soviet regime was to deliver a certain amount of equality, and they did deliver it. I mean, one way to deliver equality is to bring up the level of the have-nots to the level of the haves. And of course, redistributive mechanisms like taxes are one way in which to close the gap between the rich and the poor. In the case of the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, after the revolution, they wanted to do it very, very quickly. They wanted to close that gap. So the method they chose was to take away from the haves and to give to the have-nots. And that was the way that they closed that gap. And of course, that kind of taking away, confiscating, all of that involves violence, basically.
Yeah. The story of the kulaks, which I'm sure you're very familiar with studying Ukraine, is one that I didn't learn about until I was probably in my 30s, or maybe I did and I didn't pay attention in school. But it was the way that I kind of explain it is they were the wealthy landowning farmers. Wealthy is a relative term because it could have just been a shack and an acre, but taking from the wealthy to distribute to the poor, but then they were the best farmers. So if the best farmers are kind of taken out of commission, then it led to massive starvation and things like that. Can you just maybe, that's a sloppy way to put it. So can you maybe just give us a quick version of the story of the kulaks and why that might be, I think I always use that as a good example of when we talk about the horrors and like how the methods were really shocking and terrible. Just like how that method backfired or what was so horrible about it, a little bit about them.
Sure, especially like in view of history. I mean, that policy, which was called dekulakization, in other words, making somebody not a kulak anymore. And you're right to point out that being a rich farmer sometimes meant you had tools, or perhaps you had a cow or something like this. I mean, we're not talking about the kind of enormous agro businesses that one can see these days, let's say in the U.S. or elsewhere. But that policy of dekulakization, and what came from that then was the policy of collectivization. In other words, collectively producing all agricultural products. That was then, which Stalin implemented, that was seen as such a tremendously flawed process and such a terribly misguided initiative that, for example, in terms of history, historiography became highly, highly, highly censored. And one of the reasons why it did become censored was so that in the Soviet Union, they could mask the fact, they could hide the fact that the Communist Party committed such an egregious error that was actually against the interests of the people. Because in that part of the world, with a very, very short growing season and otherwise a tough climate, to then compromise your agricultural producing abilities led to all kinds of shortages and deficits that plagued the Soviet Union basically throughout its history. But
So
that was an instance where it was so flawed that they needed violence to level the producing qualities of peasants, but by having literally taken away land and tools and livestock from those that had it, that then made it easier to collectivize agriculture and organize agriculture on an almost industrial principle.
but it wasn't as successful. Is that accurate? Yeah.
Right. It was not successful at all.
Yeah.
And as a result, that they had always difficult growing years, but agriculture was nonetheless something that it was a hugely agrarian society, of course, when the Bolsheviks took control, and agriculture was one thing which they could do, and that was one means by which, in their attempt to try to rapidly industrialize the USSR, they did it literally on the backs of peasants, and they did it literally by exporting a lot of what they agriculturally produced. They then exported that, sold it for hard currency, and then used that money to invest in the kind of industrial machinery that allowed them to industrialize other forms of production.
But then they didn't have food.
Yes, it was uneven. I mean, in other words, the agricultural production, if you're producing, and trying to export enormous amounts of your agricultural production, obviously consumption then has to suffer at home. Right. And of course, in 1932, 1933, there was the famine that occurred, whereby they were so rigorous in collecting agricultural produce that they triggered starvation. And literally it was starvations of millions of people.
Something that I try and do in my history classes, I always try to compare it either to their lives as teenagers, or so like, here's the lesson from this battle, and then here's how you get this when you're up against big odds in your spelling bee or whatever it is. Or you're trying to convince someone, this compromise, and then here's how you compromise with your parents about your curfew. But I also try to put it in like a modern context. So this is an example that I've been using, and I love being proven wrong or sharpening my ideas. And I think you're the person to sharpen this with. So the way I was explaining this kulak's idea to my students is, and this is, maybe a little sloppy, but here's what I'm thinking is, in Los Angeles, you have the Hollywood Hills, the Beverly Hills, Bel Air, the wealthy people who live up on the side of the mountain, all the celebrities and surgeons and computer programmers and all that kind of stuff. And then on the bottom, you have, the commoners. I live at the bottom. Okay. And then you also have the poor people in the housing projects and things like that. So if this extreme concept that was used for the kulaks would be like going up into the hills and saying, you guys have 8 spare bedrooms and a heated pool that you don't go in. These people have empty cupboards. We're going to take from you 90% of what you have, or maybe 100%, and then distribute it. And you have options. You can say no, which is when the government comes and says, this is what you owe us. You can say no and see how that goes. Or you can give it up. So either way, you're going to lose that stuff. It gets distributed. And then the people at the bottom have now a lot more resources, but then they buy a computer and the computer breaks and they say, hey, I need to get my computer fixed by a computer engineer. Or they get sick and they say, hey, I need the top, neurosurgeon. And all of those people were living up in the hills. That's why they had those houses and that wealth and those resources. And now they won't be there to help them out. Now that's an extreme, and that sounds kind of like right-wingish, and I don't intend it to be, but I'm trying to use like a modern day example of what this might look like if some extreme policy like that was adopted. What are your thoughts on that?
Halfway, I'd say halfway I'm with you. And then, so if you think about like people up in Hollywood Hills, 4 people living in a 16-room house versus a 16-person family living in a 4-room apartment. So one of the things which they did was to try to make this society more equal, was to say those people with the extra rooms, you have to take a family in each of those rooms. So in other words, suddenly everybody had a similar amount of living space, but the way they did that was to people who were homeless or people who were in tremendously overcrowded situations, literally they confiscated the extra rooms of those people in the very, very large homes. But what they also did was they placed a huge emphasis on literacy and then eventually on education. Mm-hmm. So the 1920s was a time of tremendous change. So in the 1920s, that was a tremendous period of equalizing the society, both taking away from those that had, in the case of the kulaks, and other members of the aristocracy, but also a tremendous emphasis was placed on literacy, developing literacy, and expanding educational possibilities. And in this sense, in the 1920s, they made enormous, enormous strides. But the fact remained that they did use agriculture and exploitation of agricultural labor to finance industrialization. And having done so, and having rapidly industrialized in the 1930s, in many ways, this helped the Soviet Union, and this is one fact that I think very, very often gets forgotten because of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was, of course, an ally of the US during World War II. They fought alongside the US with the British and the French. And they played a vitally important role in defeating Nazi Germany. And so on one level, it's an ally. And so that de-emphasizes any motivation to criticize them. And then, of course, after that, we did go into the Cold War. But it was during this period, of course, that you had tremendous population displacement in Europe, and not so much from the former Soviet Union. That is to say that many people who were displaced or narrowly escaped, let's say Jews, for example, came to the United States, but you didn't have a similar exodus really from the former Soviet Union, especially not to the US. I mean, there were some people who were, of course, displaced, and some did come to the United States, but there were quotas about letting Russians, Ukrainians, not Jews, however, coming from the former Soviet Union, but Russians and Ukrainians and other peoples of the former Soviet Union into the United States. And so in a post-war era, you have then a sort of a double, if you will, incentive not really to focus on Stalinism and not really to focus on its horrors, because the Soviet Union, as I said, played a vital role in helping secure the Allied victory during World War II. And secondly, there were not those people who were affected by the war personally, nor their descendants who were, let's say, living in the United States. And I think you probably couldn't say that about excuse me, Nazi Germany, where clearly that was clearly an enemy state, if you will, and an aggressive state, and aggressive against other people's other states. The violent actions that occurred under Stalinism were very often against his own people. And in a post-World War II era, you didn't have anywhere near the same numbers of people coming from Russia or Ukraine or the Caucasus, Central Asia in the United States, but you did have enormous numbers of people who were displaced out of the other parts of Europe coming to the United States, who then focused on, understandably, studying Nazism so that that would never happen again.
Yeah, and I think the never again thing is so important. And you know, and again, last year when I went to all those camps, I was like, this really happened. This is horror beyond anything that I could even think up in if I had a sick enough mind to go there. And it's worse than that. But I mean, there are true horrors in Stalinism too. And like on the same, and I don't know if it's a good thing practice to compare horrific murders of children or something god awful like that, but there are things that happen that were on par with that kind of evil, and I just don't know if people are aware of it. It makes sense why they're not, but I think it's important that we do, because I wonder if the title of this episode, I wonder if there are blind spots, and therefore we would never ever get behind the idea of saying like, you know, Mein Kampf was, you know, the way that it was done by the Third Reich was not, you know, was not real Nazism, you know, or something along those lines. But you know, you could there's no sympathy even from, you know, a very right-wing, you know, pundit saying like Nazism was beneficial or there are positive elements of Nazism or anything like that. No one looks at the economy and goes, well, you know what, they did some pretty good engineering. Like even that's like pretty extreme to talk about Werner von Braun or something, but that does get brought up about the Soviet Union. And I wonder if you think that is that fair to say that, you know, it's different enough because of the things that you mentioned, that we can, you know, maybe speak, you know, with a more nuanced brush about communism and the USSR, where we shouldn't do that as much with Nazism?
Well, I mean, a lot of ink has been spilled to try to understand Stalinism. And for starters, you know, we do speak about Stalinism. And that's because I think most scholars feel that, you know, there was a sharp break. The question is, in other words, so that under Stalin, you had a qualitatively different kind of a regime. The question is, what is it a break with? Is it a break with Leninism, or is it a break with Marxism?
Right.
And, you know, adding to all of this is the fact that although the Soviet Union called itself the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, of course it was led by the Communist Party, and it was communist ideology. They felt that they were a socialist state, but that they were aspiring to communism. So in other words, you have a bifurcation there too. Are we talking about socialism in the USSR? Are we talking about communism? Or are we talking about Stalinism?
Okay.
And I think most people would say we're really talking about Stalinism, that there was so many changes were and initiatives were embraced and implemented by Stalin that really not only don't have roots in Leninism, but don't have roots in Marxism, and certainly don't have roots in the kind of early socialist utopian thinkers. And of course, they have literally zero roots in the kind of social democracies that we see in Scandinavia.
Yeah, like, would you say that? Yeah, so like, I mean, was Lenin also was murderous, right? And you know, try to even that. I mean, some of that happened under Lenin, right? Like take, you know, Robin Hood style, take from the rich, take them down to distribute to the poor. I mean, that was done under Lenin too.
Yes,
But
that's
it was
absolutely.
like an ongoing kind of evolution.
Yes, I mean, Lenin wrote extensively that the end justifies the means. In other words, achieving equality and enlightenment, as he called it, you know, that justified violent means. And so in that sense, you know, and of course the state came into being via a revolution. And a confiscation of property and power. So it was violent from the start.
Um, Professor, I wanted to bring you on. I could have looked for a historian who would kind of support what my ideas already are. And I didn't do that with you. I just sought out someone who appeared to be an expert. And I have no interest. I don't have an agenda. with any of this. I'm just really trying to figure out, what is the best way for us to understand the world and put that out to my audience. And so I guess there's a resurgence, and maybe there's never been it really going away completely because there was propaganda, but there is clearly a faction, especially among young people in America, where there's a pro-socialist kind of idea. And Jim Carrey was on Bill Maher show and said something like, we need to stop saying socialism is a bad word. Socialism is a good word. And I get elements of it. I mean, I am a progressive in many ways. And I understand that if you graduated college, you're a millennial and you're, graduated high school or college in 2008, and you would come out and like, now you can't afford a home, and you look at the massive wealth gained in the hands of very few, all the Bernie Sanders stuff. Like, I get it. But would you say that socialism, the way that it's, just from a historian point of view, not even your own personal politics, but from a historian's point of view, would you say that socialism as an economic system, a system around a country, is a bad idea, a murderous idea? And again, I'm not talking about social. I love the fire department. I'm not talking about universal health care. I think that I had Paul Song on the program, and I think that there's possibilities for that. But I'm saying overall, the idea of there should not be, excessive wealth, whatever. And then the definition of excessive gets defined by the powers that are in control. But what is your idea on this pro-socialism kind of movement, I guess, is my question.
Whenever you have a situation whereby the gap is very, very large between the haves and the have-nots, and this is then compounded by a perception that for the have-nots, it's difficult, if not impossible, to actually change their circumstances. You have two options. One has to do with legislation and making incremental changes whereby that gap closes a bit, and the desperation that the have-nots might feel begins to wane as they feel that their standard of living rising and the possibilities they have growing. Then the gap closes and the society then can carry on. But when there is a perception that it's unlikely that legislation, a political means, is at all going to be effective in terms of closing that gap. The other option is, of course, revolution. In other words, via violent means to force the kinds of changes. And this is one of the reasons why, if you look at Marx's writings, Marx always thought that socialism would be achieved in the most developed of European societies at the time. That's why he thought Germany would be the first one that would move from a capitalist into a socialist mode. Precisely because it was the most developed, it was the most educated, the most industrialized, and so on and so on. But what we saw over the course of the 20th century was it was precisely the reverse. It was enormously impoverished agrarian societies, whether we're talking about the USSR or China or the various Nicaragua and Cuba and other Latin American countries. It were these highly polarized, highly stratified societies that had a small number, a small segment of the population that held the overwhelming amount of wealth within the society, and then an impoverished peasantry. It was precisely in those kinds of societies that were ripe for revolution and for a sort of a Marxist agenda that forces the closing of the gap. Those were the kinds of societies that embraced not just socialism, but socialism via revolution.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. Like the idea that the people who live in Bel Air have so much, but I guess where I come to a problem with this is there's actually no better time to ever be poor than in well, maybe not right now because of the coronavirus. So now it's kind of going backwards a little bit, but say 6 months ago, like the gap is widening, but it's almost like it's all ships are rising, just not at the same level. Where there
not to
are
the same degree.
Yeah, like there are, I would rather be poor now than 50 years ago. But my question is like, is it about caring for the? One of the things that I heard someone speak about, and I don't know, I want to know your thoughts on this, is the push for socialist ideas, by your estimation, would it be more of a hatred of the rich as opposed to a love for the poor?
I think it's neither, actually.
Okay.
I think the problem is, especially speaking about millennials,
Yeah.
Many understand that if they don't get a college education, they won't be able to become the people they would like to be, and they're unlikely to have the kind of standard of living they would like to have. So they have to get a college education. But in order to get a college education, then they have to go so seriously into debt that they begin to jeopardize other aspects of their ambitions or the plans that they have for the future. In other words, a whole variety of professions then become not possible. I mean, you're unlikely to become an artist if you have to take on that kind of debt. You're unlikely to work for a nonprofit. It goes on and on and on.
For sure.
And you perhaps have to delay buying a home. And as
What
we
about
know,
history, though? Like in the
What's
Soviet Union, do you think that the uprising, what was done to the various aristocratic class, would you say that was a hatred of them for being well, like that was the propaganda that was pushed, was these are bad people, or was it a love for the poor? Not as much now, but like back then, like historically.
it was a push to get rid of unearned privilege.
Okay.
In other words,
Yeah.
there was the perception somebody, because of to whom they were born or what station in society they were born into, they had tremendous privileges, advantages. In fact, they had an entirely different set of rights. And as a result, they could live in an entirely different way. They were allowed to have expectations and experiences that the vast majority of the population knew they would never, ever have.
Yeah, and
So I
that's
think
so.
it was
Yeah, sorry.
more unearned privilege.
Which is so hard to, and again, who decides what's unearned privilege? Because that's a tough thing, because like my wife is an immigrant, came here from the Philippines and didn't have much, and her family worked really hard, and now her dad owns a business and she owns a business, and she, by a lot of standards, would be upper class now, but that it was earned every step of the way. I mean, by the intersectionality matrix, she's a brown woman of color who was ESL and all that kind of stuff, was up against a lot of things and still succeeded. And many do, many don't. But that, I think we could all get behind that. The kid who was born into a wealthy family, his dad handed him the keys to the factory and he just was lazy and partied a lot and Paris Hilton style. Like, we agree with that. But the problem is, the 14th Amendment is, the laws apply equally. And if you're going after wealth, you're going to go after Paris Hilton's wealth and take away her gold-plated yacht, then you got to go after the immigrant who just hustled for 40 years. And that's a tricky thing. How do we work that out? Was that brought into, just historically, like, was that brought into consideration that some of these people that they're going after the wealth of, they really earned it and then others did not?
But it was a different kind of a society. I mean, it was a feudal, these are feudal societies where wealth is inherited.
Right.
So it's totally incomparable.
Yeah.
You were born with tremendous, tremendous land holdings. And they managed them, you could say. Somebody managed those tremendous land holdings. They managed or they at least arranged for somebody to manage the enormous labor forces they had. But the system was entirely self-perpetuating, and it was self-perpetuating such that it guaranteed people, by virtue of their birthright, by virtue of their station in society, the continuation of that unearned privilege. And for others, their station in society guaranteed them a life of poverty, precisely because of to whom they were born or where they were born. So it's kind of incomparable with the United States. In other words,
United States today.
immigrant
Yeah.
story today. If you look at like the motivation for a revolution, and I should say, the Bolsheviks were a very small minority. They were really, really a very, very small minority. It wasn't as if there was broad popular support for the Bolsheviks. I mean, they were skilled tacticians and tacticianers, and they were able to launch a successful revolution. And they had to then educate their population to say, well, they had to literally teach them how to read and literally had to educate them so as to begin to improve their lot in life. I mean, I think what we see in the United States today is, for example, when that our healthcare system, when it becomes for people who are in small businesses and who are working, who still cannot afford healthcare, and how about what then happens for those who, even if they do have healthcare, grappling with a system that has tens of millions of people who don't.
Yeah.
And there is a certain level of strain there. And as if that's not obvious, you need to have something like a pan epidemic where people then have no health care and are afraid to get tested because they can't pay for it. Or even if they do get sick and they're highly contagious, they might hesitate to go to a hospital because they can't pay for it. But their illness then places others in the society in a vulnerable position. And so increasingly, I think today, there's an awareness that when some people are, let's say, use the example of locked out of healthcare, then that begins to affect the overall strength of the fabric of society. And I think in a place like Russia or China, even afterward, and other places in Latin America, there's a sense that the society will never, as long as an overwhelming majority of the population is consumed with basic daily survival, the society will never be robust and it will never be a prosperous society. It will always have to be a society where, once again, the very wealthy have to once again use violence to protect those privileges so as to perpetuate them. And I think in a place like Russia was notoriously, at the time of the revolution, was notoriously referred to as backward. And one of the reasons why it was backward was because the overwhelming majority of the population were impoverished peasants. And China was, of course, also similarly dismissed as, a country with no future. And that was, once again, I think just the weight of the poverty and the weight of the overwhelming majority of the members of those societies not being able to prosper beyond just ensuring their own survival.
Yeah. And that, I think, is something that I just say over and over again as a history teacher. Is part of what history is so useful for, is getting a perspective about where we are today compared to where we as human beings were, just a few generations ago. And in America, yes, it is not an equal playing field. Yeah, I play basketball against LeBron James. It is not equal. But we have to play by the same rules. And this is only 1 or 2 generations old. But LeBron has to play by the same rules as me, even though it is grossly unfair. And if you can afford tutors and things like that, it is grossly unfair. And I think we should be inching toward getting to a better place, but without forgetting that it is more possible than ever to rise up with technology and all that kind of stuff. And that's debatable, but let's say it's maybe not than ever, but it's more possible than it was in, pre-revolution Russia. For if you were born poor, you were stuck poor. And there are enough examples now where you can get out, but you have very few get out of jail free cards, essentially, if you're born into the lower class today in America. So to wrap it up though, Professor, like what would, I guess, we want to, I think most of us, and I'll just speak for myself, but we want to inch toward, be progressive in the best ideas, which is getting toward a place where we have a competence hierarchy, where we have the best people doing the best jobs, a fair game. So that means not giving massive amounts of handouts to certain corporations and not other corporations. We want a fair game. We want the best people in the best positions, all that kind of stuff. We want the best education. We want to inch toward that. But how do we know when we're gonna go too far? And from a historian point of view, what would be a message that you would want to give to young people out there, people that have the sickle and hammer on signs, who are marching and saying like, this is what we need? I think that they're misguided a bit. I think that I understand what their anger might be for, but do you have a message for people out there that are saying like, we want socialism in America, and maybe just like for things for them to be aware of, like, here's where you've gone too far, or something along those lines? Just a message for people about the importance of knowing, Soviet Union, communism, socialist history, and how to best apply that today.
I think all regimes, whether they're right-wing or left-wing, have the potential to become authoritarian. And I think that's what one should focus on. How is it that we become either seduced by a charismatic leader, or how is it that the seeds of doubt are sown such that we realize too late, or too few of us realize, that we are increasingly giving up our rights. We are increasingly allowing a two-tiered system to develop, whereby a certain small group has political rights and the vast majority do not. So it's important to become sensitized as to how authoritarianism takes root. And one thing which, if you study Soviet history, you find some very, very disturbing parallels that happen increasingly these days. And I think maybe some millennials, they might not realize that something similar happened under Stalin, but they sense a sense of unease. The phrase enemy of the people, for example, which gets tossed around about the press these days. The press is the enemy of the people. And the idea of sowing doubt, like they don't tell the truth, they lie. This phrase, enemy of the people, of course, was used with great verve under Stalin, and it was very clear that certain groups of people were designated as enemies, and enemies of their own people, much the way that some people paint journalists today.
Yeah.
They are, you might not realize it, but they're against you. You might not realize it, but they're lying to you. You might not realize it, but they're manipulating you. And this destabilization of the truth, so that you never really are entirely certain what the truth is, who exactly you can believe. That's one key way. If you destabilize what the meaning of the truth is, then the truth can be sort of whatever it gets fabricated into. And of course, whether it's Hitler or whether it's Stalin, they were masters at that, of owning the truth and telling you what the truth was and sowing seeds of doubt. And one of the ways they did it was both of them was by making people feel afraid. And that's why you had to have these enemies of the people. So whether you're talking about certain figures being demonized, or whether certain political parties, people with other kinds of views, people from certain parts of the world, demonizing those people and making those people threatening. This is something that occurred under Nazism with the Jews, of course, under Stalinism with the kulaks, with the bourgeois aristocrats, with the clergy, with a whole variety of national groups. And this is, I think, something that we see happening today, with whether rhetoric about Mexicans being rapists, or, as I said, press being enemies of the people, and certain places and peoples in the world being against us, wanting to hurt us. I mean, these are tried and true tactics of authoritarian regimes.
Absolutely, yeah.
I would also, what you also see in under Stalin and under Hitler is a real fear of criticizing the leader, of delivering bad news to the leader, a compulsion almost to offer praise,
Right.
effusive praise and compliments. I would just cite a few examples of, in Stalin's case, for example, when he would give a speech, no one wanted to be the first one to stop clapping.
Right, I remember reading that. Yeah.
And so it led to almost absurd situations whereby a group, he would give a speech and the applause would just be ongoing because no one would stop. No one wanted to be the first to stop. And there was the same kind of compulsory complimenting of his intelligence and his acumen and his leadership, and a cult of these figures as almost infallible, father-like figures, cultivated. And I would, this is the reason I think why students, and I would hope everybody would be a lifelong student of these kinds of authoritarian regimes, because on some level, some of their tactics are just repackaged and reused. And one of the reasons that's so is because they tend to be quite effective. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why we should study Stalin and study what he did. And I think it's important to look at the totality of what he did, because in some instances, there were some people within the former Soviet Union that did see a very, very, very tangible improvement in their daily life. And this led them to support Stalin and to say it was a fair trade, if you will. Okay, we don't have those freedoms, but we get other things, whether it's a material benefit or whether it's feeling as if we are now privileged because, let's say, we're members of the Communist Party, or because we're Russian nationals. It's another form of unearned privilege, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a lot of things, and because I'm Cylinder Radio and it's both sides, like obviously we're going to look at and hold this lens up to our president and things that he does, because he's kind of a wild man and stuff like that. But we can also look at it like the journalists. I think calling them fake news is dangerous, agreed, but they also have they are blinded, I feel like, in a lot of ways for their hatred of Donald Trump. So many mainstream journalists that they print stuff that is not vetted very well. And I've found so many examples, and I had to go off like the main pathway and start following a lot more. And because I'm like Cylinder Radio guy, I have follow like equal left and right wing. And there's so much that's being said and done. Like when Trump does something positive, that gets almost no news at all. But when he does something negative, it gets all the news. And just like the news seems very polarized. So when you said something like, who can you believe? That's accurate. I've found many news stories by like the New York Times that I go, wait, this is not true at all. And then, reached out to friends of mine in journalism or wherever it is. And they were like, oh yeah, wow, I can't believe the New York Times posted that. It's like, yeah, like it's not just against Trump. Like the idea of a charismatic leader or the idea of being scared to criticize. No one's scared to criticize Trump. I mean, if you look at like late night news or something like that, but there are people you can't criticize, and that could be getting into a whole thing of like, on like social justice stuff. Like can you criticize, people who are a certain race or things like that? And that gets into like some murky territory, but I just want to try and just say to the audience that this is not something that is only focused. I'm not saying that you're saying this, Professor, but like only on Donald Trump or only on right wing. Like this can come from anywhere. And a charismatic leader, Trump is a lot of things, and some people might find him charismatic. I think a lot of people don't. They think he's kind of goofy, but there are people that definitely are charismatic and are charming, and people are kind of get under the spell of them. I know that there were a lot of people that felt that Obama, who I think by a lot of people's standards would believe that he's a better president, but people said that he was so charming that the news didn't hold him up to a rigorous enough standard. So I'm just trying to show the balance here, that this can really come from anywhere. And freedom of speech is so important, that you can speak out against your leaders, be critical. But I just urge people, when you're talking about the news stuff, all journalists to be very careful about how you criticize leaders, because you want to tell the truth. Because the problem with the idea of fake news is that it has some merit to it. That's if they didn't run fake stories, then or false stories that turn out to be false, then there would be no backing to that by a lot of people. But they've done enough that it gets people to go, oh man, like they are lying about Donald Trump, or they are leading this, and then Trump can jump on that. Where when I criticize our president to my class or on my podcast or something, I'm very careful, because I don't like him personally. He holds a lot of personality traits that I despise in a human being. But I'm very careful that if I'm going to criticize him, I make sure that I cross my T's and dot my I's, because I don't want to be held to, hey, you said something negative about him that turned out to be not true. And I think that that's just something that I just want to, because it's still on the radio, just present as well, because clearly he does things that are wrong and we need to watch those. But I think we need to hold the same standard to a really charming, good looking, whatever it might be, really kind sounding person, because he comes off like a bull in a china shop. So it's very easy to say like, oh, well, he's bad. But someone could come in at some point in the future, in the future generations, who is not, who's very charming and very cool or very well put together, and they can be equally as dangerous. That's just something I want to say. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think tactics for building an authoritarian regime are quite similar. I mean, that's why I was mentioning whether you look at, Nazism or Stalinism or tactics in U.S. politics today. The tactics are very, very similar, and they're similar because they're effective.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why it doesn't matter what the specific end is. They help build. They can potentially help build. This is why one should study Stalinism, so as to become sensitized as to how a regime, even if you think the goals of a particular regime are very laudable and very positive, and you support them,
sounds
how
good. Yeah.
Even those kinds of goals can go the means that they use to achieve them, if those aren't equally as honorable, those goals can be perverted, and the consequences can become very, very different from what was intended. And that is true about a charismatic leader who can seem very appealing, but if you see them beginning to use certain tactics, those tactics can amount eventually to a certain form of authoritarianism. And I think we're in a moment of, we'll see whether the coronavirus shifts things, but we're in a moment of sort of populism. Yeah. And I think, easy solutions to very, very, very increasingly complex problems. And I think, on one level, problems were also complex that Germany faced in the 1930s and Russia faced in wanting to transform this large, large empire into a more prosperous state, and in particular wanting to do it very, very quickly. And that's where things went off track.
Absolutely. I think that's a great place to end. Watch the means. Watch the means in which that, because we're going to have blind spots. If you're a MAGA hat wearer, then you're going to think Trump does all good. And if you, despise it, you think he's going to do all bad. Or if you have a Bernie bumper stickers on your car, then he's all good. And because of that, we seek confirmation bias, and we're going to have blind spots. Going back to the title of this, we're going to have blind spots about the things that we connect to and we believe are good. And that's going to really make us a little ignorant about things that are pretty important. So I love what you said, Professor. Watch the means in which to get this. So if we want to get, more equality in society. How? We want to, raise up this group. How? We want to get more diversity. How? The means are really, really important. And that is something that we can all focus on, because it's the end goal could sound wonderful, but the means to get there could be horrendous. And I think that's a great way to kind of encapsulate everything that we were talking about today. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. I know we had a little bit of like technical difficulties, but I really enjoyed this. I know it's kind of a late night for you. Is there anything that you would want to share with the audience? Any parting words or anything where the people can find what you're up to? I don't know if you have a Twitter or anything like that.
No, I don't. But I would just encourage all your students to continue to read and to think about the past, because the past can very often provide a lot of inspiration and certainly even something of a roadmap for figuring out, how to go forward. And our problems are increasingly interconnected and increasingly difficult. And as you mentioned, there are many, many different sources of information, and we need people who are very, very skilled in evaluating information and what is valid, and synthesizing that information and using it to come up with novel, creative solutions to the problems we face. And so I would just encourage all of your listeners to continue to mine the past for inspiration in the present.
I love that. Mining the past. I love that. Thank you. Catherine Wanner, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
This has been Cylinder Radio. The success of this podcast and the educational revolution that I hope you will be a part of is dependent on those who find value in it. Please take a few moments to review us on iTunes so the show is more easily found. If there was a perspective on today's topic that was not highlighted in this episode, or you have an idea for an episode topic that you want to understand more deeply, please email us at cylinderradio@gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram @WillRusch. WILLREUSCH. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to the next one.